Una mica d'atenció, si us plau, que comencem. Dambisa Moyo és economista de reconegut prestigi internacional, especialista en macroempresa i assumptes globals. Ha estat una de les persones més influents del món en quant a economia internacional. Ha treballat en el Banc Mundial com a assessora i també a Goldman Sachs com a economista de macroeconomia mundial. Ciutadana britànica, Dambisa va néixer a Zàmbia. Precisament són els seus arrels el que han provocat en ella la defensa d'un nou model de desenvolupament financer en països més pobres que també permeten el creixement d'aquests països. És autora de best-sellers com Date o How the West Was Lost. També és articulista en publicacions tan importants i conegudes com Financial Times, The Economist o Wall Street Journal. El seu darrer llibre, d'una ampli ressò internacional, porta per títol Winner Take All, China's Race for Resources and What It Means for the World. Pel que fa a Josep Maria Salleras, és professor titular d'Economia a SADE, doctor en Administració i Direcció d'Empreses i també llicenciat en Humanitats. És, per tant, un home que combina les lletres amb les ciències socials. També és director de l'MBA Part-Time i Salleras és autor també de Les instituciones y los avatares del sistema cambiario i coautor del llibre Dios tienes un email. Per tots nosaltres és un plaer presentar avui el primer face-to-face d'aquesta quarta temporada. Un aplaudiment, si us plau, pels nostres convidats. Podeu pujar?
Please, go ahead. ¿Qué tal? Okay. Now they're talking to you, the translator thing. Bé, bon dia a tothom. Dir-los en primer lloc que és un honor estar aquí juntament amb la Dambisa. El primer que vaig fer quan em van fer l'encàrrec de fer aquest face-to-face és documentar-me sobre ella, què havia escrit, en què estava treballant. Vaig encarregar el seu darrer llibre, que és un llibre realment apassionant sobre els recursos i com Xina està prenent part en aquests recursos. I un dels motius de sorpresa va ser quan al conèixer-la li vaig comentar mira, m'he llegit el llibre, sobre quins tòpics vols que parlem demà, perquè bàsicament el que he fet en els darrers temps ha sigut empapar-me del llibre. I em va respondre sorpresivament, diu, no he vingut aquí a parlar del meu llibre. El meu llibre és un tema específic, és un tema potser molt concret, i l'audiència pot estar interessada en uns temes potser més propers a ella, en la qual es vegi molt més implicada. A partir d'aquí vam començar a parlar de temes globals, de com l'economia ens pot afectar, de la zona euro, de si Anglaterra, per exemple, sortirà o no sortirà de l'euro, si això la veuria afavorida o no d'una banda a Anglaterra i si això afavoria o no el que podria ser la zona euro. A més, em va comentar, jo estic aquí també per explicar una mica la meva experiència i amb la trobada que vam tenir resulta que ve de Corea, ve de Hong Kong, ha estat a Cape Town, Sud-àfrica en el darrer mes, sempre donant conferències sobre la seva visió dels negocis a nivell global. En aquest sentit, és una oradora d'excepció. És a dir, podem parlar, o de fet vam estar parlant gairebé de qualsevol tema. El seu background acadèmic i la seva trajectòria professional crec que així ho acrediten. I jo crec que per començar, un bon tema que a més ha sorgit ja a la taula seria veure quines són les perspectives sobre el 2013. We will talk about the perspectives about the 2013. How do you see the global economy, the emerging markets, and so on? So, what do you think about the new year? The snake year, as the Chinese said. It's a good year for us, or would be a horrible year for Europe?
Buenos días y gracias. I think the best way to answer the question about where the world is going this year and next year is to think about where we have come from over the last 6 to 8 months. About 6 months ago, last summer, the world was a very negative place. So the main stories that were dominating the economic headlines were Brexit, the risks of Greece leaving the Eurozone, the concerns about the European Euro breakup, and also a lot of concerns about the hard landing in China, speculation that China would actually start to grow economically below 6%. But also, during the summer of last year, there were a lot of concerns about the US election, because we were planning to have an election in November of last year, and there was a lot of uncertainty around how the US election would go. So since that very volatile time when the markets were responding and there were lots of concerns amongst policymakers, I think things have moved to a much more positive or maybe neutral environment. The policymaking comments from Chancellor Merkel, from a lot of the European governments, but also from the policymakers like Mario Draghi at the ECB are much more constructive, that they will support the Eurozone. In addition, we have seen that China's economy has not hard landed like many people had forecast. The expectation is that it will probably grow around 7%, probably closer to 7.8%. And then also there's been a lot of political uncertainty that has been cleared up because of the US election that was held in November. Having said all of this, there are still many concerns that remain in the global economy. The IMF forecasts, the new forecasts came out just last month in January, and although the expectation is that regions like China and India and Africa will continue to grow at around 5.8, maybe 6% and higher, most other regions will continue to struggle through 2013. In particular, we continue to expect that we'll see economic growth from the United States at maybe around 1.22%. And obviously in the European zone, there are lots of different expectations, but it can be anything from around 1%, maybe in Germany, to contractions in many other places around the Eurozone. The emerging markets also, particularly the big emerging markets, such as Brazil, China and India, are also seeing a market slowdown in their economies because they are very much linked into the European economy as well as the US economy. So although there are some positive stories, things like the US recovery in housing, the sort of optimism around shale gas and what that might mean for energy, and also some evidence that maybe the consumer has come back in the United States, there are still very real concerns around the economies in Europe, but also the large economies in the emerging world where 90% of the world lives today. So I think the outlook is optimistic, but with some caution around what happens. And maybe the last thing I can say to this is that everything I've said so far is really about short-term tactical positive story. But the big problem that the world continues to face, and having just come from China and from Korea yesterday, the big issues that remain for a lot of people and policymakers are the structural, longer-term considerations, things like youth unemployment, which is now at about 100 million people globally, around between the ages of 18 and 25 that are unemployed, concerns around debts and deficits, particularly in the developed world, but also concerns around productivity and what that might mean for globalization and trade regime. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. But right now, for example, you said that the US economy is just showing 1.2%. Do you think that this is a growth enough in order to take the whole world out of the recession?
So definitely not. The United States, the trend growth number that we need to see is at least a 3 in the front or even a 4%. This is largely because, as you know, the United States relative to Europe has a relatively young population because it's got a lot more immigrants. And so the United States needs to continue to grow much higher than where it is growing today. And if you look around the emerging world also, the United Nations has argued that the emerging economies, because they've got a lot of pockets of poverty and very young populations, in the emerging world, 60 to 70% of the population is under the age of 24. So very, very young populations. Those places need to grow at least 6% in order to keep economic growth and to meaningfully put a dent in poverty. So you can see that if the global picture of the world is that we'll be growing at around 2 to 3%, that is not enough, which is why, although people are feeling some positive aspects for the short term, we still are very concerned about how we will be able to deliver in the long term these economic growth rates of over 6% in the emerging world.
Mm-hmm. Because if you look at the States, again, you see that the consumption is just sluggishing. They have a huge problem of debt. And again, the government has not enough money to pump the economy. So what source can the states can do in order to grow again?
So the real risk, as you've just outlined, is many people understand what needs to happen. Mm-hmm. We do need to get domestic demand, so Americans wanting to buy things again. But at the same time, the government has basically got a situation with the fiscal cliff and also having hit the debt ceiling. Mm-hmm. As you know, China is the largest lender, foreign lender to the US government right now. And even they are now worried. The Chinese are worried, we keep giving money to America, but what is it exactly that they're using that money for? And as you know, one of the biggest problems is that the borrowing itself is not a bad thing. The problem is, what do you do when you borrow that money? And what the United States and many European countries did was to consume the money instead of invest it in productive ventures. So the situation in the United States is, I think, complicated by the political environment, because the decisions that need to be made are very difficult decisions, but the political infrastructure and the infighting between the Republicans and the Democrats means that nobody can actually take those very difficult decisions that need to be made. And this myopia, the fact that they have elections every 2 years, means that they're always trying to implement policies that are very supportive and good for the short term, but not addressing consumption, education, infrastructure, the big structural problems, healthcare in the United States, that are unsustainable over the long term. My expectation is that over time, the United States will struggle to raise money. And I think that a lot of the entitlements around pensions and healthcare, which have been promised, will start to become much more significantly cut.
Because Krugman, for example, a month ago wrote that what the government should do is just, debt has increased even more. Do you agree with that economist, or do you prefer Niall Ferguson and say, oh no way, we have just to leverage the whole country in order to grow again?
So one of the debates that the economists have had since the 2009 crisis is the one you've just expressed. Should we be printing money, cutting interest rates, going very aggressively to keep the economies going? Or should we recognize that it might be debt and too much cheap funding that actually put us into the problem that we're in today? My view is and none of us really know the answer. So what do I mean? I think in Europe, for example, there's still a lot of room and scope to cut interest rates further. As you know, the ECB rate is at 0.75, but the other major economies, the UK, the US, and Japan, have interest rates that are lower. And there's some discussion now about negative interest rates. And I think Europe has room to cut interest rates further. And I think it probably should, given the ongoing problems in these economies. In the UK, the story is quite different from the US. The US has been throwing money through the quantitative easing programs. Now they're basically printing $85 billion every month. And that, I think, may be supportive of the housing recovery, which I talked about earlier, but it can be very damaging for the rest of the world, because often that can be inflationary And many countries, particularly the president of Brazil, Dilma Rousseff, has complained that by the United States printing money every month, it's causing inflation in Brazil, because people you take the money and they start to buy property in Brazil. The UK has taken a very different approach. They've gone for austerity. And I think that, again, because at these two extremes, it can be very damaging, and it has been very damaging for the UK economy. The UK economy is the only major economy that's back in a recession, a triple dip recession after December, and the IMF is encouraging the UK to start to spend more money and move away from such an aggressive stance around austerity. I think the truth of what needs to happen is somewhere in the middle. Clearly, we as the global economy cannot support the sort of excess spending that has occurred in the past. I'm sure many in this room will be aware of the statistic that Angela Merkel made in January, that Europe represents 7%, just 7% of the world's population. I mentioned the rest of the emerging markets are 90%. But with 7% of the world's population, Europe has 25% of GDP, so it's a very important part of the world's GDP, but it represents 50% of all the welfare spending of the world. And so this imbalance in the economy is clearly unsustainable when economic growth around the world is now going to about 3%. So it's those types of issues that I think makes policymakers need to make the balance between having maybe less aggressive austerity in the short term, but to have a plan in place to make sure that the young people, the next generation, are able to find jobs and employment and to live in a place where the infrastructure actually exists. So what I mean by that is the focus should not be on printing money just for the sake of printing money. You need to print money, or you need to cut interest rates, have loose monetary and fiscal policy only to the extent that you're investing in productive ventures and productive infrastructure.
We have moved from the States to the United Kingdom, and now we're nearly touching the Europe. You know, Europe has like two speeds, one of them in the countries of the north, the one and then for us, and the same monetary policy. You said that you have still some room to decrease our interest rate, but what about the liquidity trap? Because 70% or zero, that's much enough sense?
So I think that I'm not, on this point, I'm not going to say something you've never heard before. You know, I think everybody knows what the situation is in Europe. I think the main problem in Europe right now is that you don't have a fiscal pact, and I think they're trying to figure out a way to retroactively figure out a way to get that in place. But I really do not believe that Europe has a big risk on the liquidity trap side. I think on balance, the risk is that the austerity might have gone too far in some countries. And again, I don't want to sound like we don't need austerity. We do need some areas where there's been too much excess. But at the same time, I think in order to get out of the situation of negative growth rates or contraction in the economy, there has to be spending, but the question is what type of spending needs to occur. And on the monetary policy side, we know that there is room for them to continue to cut rates. Denmark, for example, now has negative interest rates. So in other words, they are paying people to go and spend money, and you can think of it that way. And one of the ECB spokespeople, Constancio, just last week was talking about the possibility of negative interest rates in the Eurozone. And I think that they should be thinking about that, creating a more looser approach to the economy, again, in the short term, with the expectation that they've got a clear growth plan over the next medium to longer term.
And now we heard about some referendum in the UK in order to, be part of the EU or just leave. You live in London for a while, so what are more or less the environment over there about this issue?
So here, I think I was very disappointed to hear that the Prime Minister suggested such a thing, especially at this time. I think there's a very high risk that people especially at difficult times, they vote for things that are not necessarily that what they think over the long term will be beneficial. Let me answer you in another way. I've had the very good fortune of traveling to over 50 countries around the world. And for some countries, it's very easy for me to give advice. Those are many countries in Africa or South America where the governments have really not done a lot of the easy things to, encouraging trade, creating flexible workforce, having more privatization. They've not done those things. And so it's very easy to say to them, well, you need to become more transparent, you need to have less corruption, you need to do more trade. It's very easy. And then there's some countries that I would say is very difficult to advise. And those are countries that I would say are large, middle income, maybe a bit higher income countries that have done all the right things but have found themselves in a difficult place. Let me give you some examples. South Africa, great example. Korea, I was just in Korea. Malaysia. And I think the UK is basically going to be in that group now. Why are these countries in a difficult place? They're in a difficult place because they've done a lot of the right things. They've encouraged trade, they've been part of the global economy, they've been quite open, they have relatively little corruption. But unfortunately for them, they are not part of a larger trading bloc. And it makes it very difficult for them to compete. And if you think about an investor, what is the decision that they have to make between investing? Think about how difficult the decision it is for them to make between investing between Korea and Malaysia. If I ask someone from Telefonica or a company in Spain, which country would you prefer to invest in, Malaysia or Korea, the countries are very similar. If I say Colombia and South Africa, very similar. And the UK, by removing itself from the Eurozone, is putting itself amongst that group of countries where there's not a very strong or compelling story to go and invest in Europe or in the UK. When UK is part of Europe, the story becomes much more compelling because it then is a gateway to a larger economic union. If I may for a moment, I can also give you an example of where I come from. I'm from Zambia, a small country. It's got about 10 million people. Nobody cares about Zambia by itself. But as part of Southern Africa, it's 300 million people. And if you put Southern Africa together, all of a sudden, it becomes a big enough economic zone that people start to say, businesses start to say, this is quite interesting, we might be able to market our products there. So I think I understand why in the UK people are slightly frustrated with the way that the European situation has unfolded. I do think that the Anglo-West, so the UK and the US, don't really understand the Eurozone very much. If I may, I'm sorry to speak so much, but if I may just explain a little bit what I mean here. I was at a dinner last month with President Sarkozy, former president from France, and he made a very interesting point. He said, the people in the UK and in the US, they don't understand that the Eurozone construction is not just an economic venture. It's a political construct, one in which it has to hold together, and it's really an outgrowth of World War II. And he said the mistake that the media and the politicians in America and the UK make is they think it's just economic. And they say, oh, they just need a fiscal union, they need more austerity. And if they don't do those things, the Eurozone's going to break up. And President Sarkozy's point is that there was never a risk that the Eurozone would ever break up because of the political rationale that this union has to work. And it's only the people and the countries that existed during World War II who experienced it very firsthand who can understand that the Eurozone will not break up. And I think that is really important. And I think, once again, that made me think that the decision for a referendum in the UK was quite naive and perhaps didn't really understand the broader context of the Eurozone.
I heard a really, let's say, weird story about this referendum. And it's related to the weight of the GDP financial sector in the UK. As you point out quite well, there is an initiative that we need more fiscal pact, how to fix the banks. The banking sector is not quite good right now. And, you know, if there is more rules, more legislation, part of this financial sector could lose power in the UK. And I heard that maybe this is, you know, behind the curtain, they are moving strings in order to promote these kind of things to avoid this deregulation.
Well, I think the whole idea of financial regulation, if you think back to the G20 meeting that was held in Philadelphia, I believe it was 2009, just after the financial crisis, the agenda at that time was very clear to have a global approach to financial regulation. That was what they planned to do. So now here we are 4 years later, 2013, and actually what has happened is that there's been a disintegration and a schism, a split amongst the countries in terms of how to deal with the banks. And if you think about it, I can understand why that's the case. The reason that's the case is because the countries that they operate in are at very different levels of economic recovery. So, for example, the European countries are much less excited or are less keen to have aggressive banking reform when credit channels in these economies are still very difficult. The United States, that's seeing a bit of a recovery, is much more ahead in terms of trying to be more aggressive, perhaps. But then even the UK is even more aggressive than that as part of its austerity program. So instead of having a union around what needs to happen in the banking sector, instead we've had this split in the banking sector. As I'm sure you know, the banking sector in the United States represents about 56% of GDP. In the UK, it's over 70% of the country's GDP. To be quite honest, that's quite unsustainable because you cannot have a situation. And by the way, by some estimates, it's larger than the UK GDP. There's some estimates that say the banking sector is bigger than the economy. You cannot have that as a sustainable model because the banking sector is supposed to be a tool to deliver economic growth. It's not supposed to be economic growth in of itself. So I'm a bit skeptical about the point you've just raised. But I will say that if there's one big issue that I think will continue to be difficult in capitalist societies, private capitalist societies of the West and the United States, is how do you get those credit channels working again in the banking sector, particularly when the banks are not working under a unified global framework.
Because when you talk about the Philadelphia 2009, the agenda, the first issue was fiscal paradise, and there is no anymore. Around the world, do you hear something about it? Why this particular issue has just left the agenda?
Well, here I'd like to point out a statement which I have on my computer, but I don't remember the exact words, but President Theodore Roosevelt in the United States after World War II, it was after the financial crisis, 1929 crash, he said, and it's not exactly what he said, but he said, when countries are in difficulty and they have to make a choice between globalization and national interests, they will always pick national interests. And for me, that's where the world is right now. One of the things that I do, I'm a member of a group of 30 people that advise the governments on the G20 agenda. So we were in Mexico and we were obviously in Russia last week. And what is very clear is that governments are moving away from this unified view about how can we solve the world. So think about before 2009, we had the WTO, everybody was focusing on trade. We had Copenhagen Consensus, everyone was focusing on environment. And we had a lot of folks from the G20 around banking reform that would be unified. But where are we today? We now live in a world where the UK and the US don't agree on how to deal with this. The UK, austerity. The US is more about quantitative easing and increasing expenditure. We have a situation where the Chinese have implemented export bans for rare earth minerals. In fact, the US and the European Union and Japan have sued China in the EU for protectionism. And we have a situation where, basically in the banking sector, banks are basically under different global regimes, and the global agenda that was planned is nowhere to be seen. What we see, I believe we're seeing instead, is a very high risk of this attitude of every nation for itself. So we're seeing much more in terms of protectionism and tariffs. The EU has put out a report just a few months ago saying that there have been at least almost 200 new quotas and tariffs, primarily from the United States and European countries. But as I mentioned to you a moment ago, China is also involved. We're also seeing much less globalization. You've heard the announcement last week from the State of the Union address from President Obama that he's trying to build a trading bloc between the US and Europe. So it's those types of trading blocs and more inward-looking decisions that are being made around policy making that I fear are going to lead us to a situation where we'll have much less globalization, much more protectionism, which again, we're seeing a lot of protectionism in resources, the Argentina YPF situation, the Australians raising taxes, Mongolia, Bolivia, there are many examples of that. So we'll see much more protectionism, much less globalization, I fear, potentially bigger welfare states, because obviously the income inequality problem is becoming a much bigger problem now in the aftermath of the financial crisis. And I think also from the emerging markets world, there's a big risk that countries will start to pivot towards the Chinese model, which is two things. Number one, not prioritizing democracy, so democracy becomes a second point. And number two is prioritizing the role of the state in the economic affairs. So I think that's the picture that we're looking at now.
Very frightened. You said that you are in a group that talked to the G20. Do you think that the last comment of Angela Merkel about the euro at 140 is not a measure trying to, coordinate the whole recovery? Because if this is true, the European market will pay a huge invoice for that, and it's just for the sake of it.
So when I was in Korea earlier this week, I was with two eminent economists. To preserve their dignity, I will not say their names, but very well respected. Well, okay, I'll say one of them. Danny Roderick, who's very, very respected, very serious guy.
I know Danny.
And he's written a lot about some of the issues we're talking about now. Danny Roderick is Turkish born, but is a professor at Harvard now. And we had a long discussion because, as you know, the yen, the story about the Japanese yen weakening so dramatically, what does that mean for what we in economists call beggar thy neighbor policies? What does it mean for other countries who also start to try and reduce their, weaken their exchange rates so that they can have better trade flows? And it was very interesting because there's a debate right now that splits into two. Policymakers and a lot of the G20 are saying it's okay to weaken your currency if weakening your currency is the consequence of domestic demand policies. So if the government starts to do fiscal spending and that forces the currency down, that's okay. That's very different from what they would say a place like China would, which is basically just fixing their exchange rates. So that's one side of the story. So the policymakers did not censure Japan for weakening its currency because their view is what Japan is doing is trying to get its own domestic demand to grow. It has nothing to do with what Japan is doing to impact the world exchange rates. On the other side, and I mentioned this a moment ago, is you have comments from people like President Dilma Rousseff in Brazil, and a lot of the BRICS economies, so Brazil, Russia, India, China. But also, as I mentioned, I was just in Korea. Even the Koreans are very worried about this type of policy. The Koreans have Japan as one of their top 3 major trading partners. And they say if the Japanese are now being allowed to weaken their currency, the consequences for these countries I've just mentioned, and particularly the emerging markets, are that are very negative for their trade flows. So there's almost a war going on between the policymakers and the markets, and these, particularly the emerging markets, who are saying this type of action is hurting us. Now, I don't know what the outcome is going to be. I've heard about this 140. I've heard many different arguments around where even the US dollar could go. But what I would say, without belaboring the point, is I point you again to Teddy Roosevelt's comment, which is that when countries have and policymakers have their backs to the wall and have to make decisions, they will care less about what's going to impact the rest of the world, and they'll care much more about what's happening with their own countries.
So, in your view, you have to convince people to go back to globalization. More globalization will foster growth, and then the trickle-down effect means that the distribution of wealth will be better?
So that's a difficult question, because I believe in the free markets. I do. Not without constraints. I believe that they need to be regulated, but I believe that the free markets have proven themselves to be the best way to deliver economic growth, to reduce poverty, and ultimately to create freedom. But I'm also not so naive to understand that there's no such a thing as a real free market. As you know, I'm from Africa, and for the past 50 years, African countries have not been able to sell their produce, agriculture produce, into Europe or to the United States because of subsidy programs. So obviously, there's no such a thing as free trade. Now, what does that mean for globalization? I think in an ideal world, I think that countries should produce what they're best at producing, and they should not produce the things that they are not good at producing. And unfortunately, I think in the world today, because of job pressures, the pressures of youth unemployment, of income inequality, policymakers are focused on the short term, and therefore very focused on making sure that, that they are much more interested in non-globalization agenda and towards more protectionist agenda.
Mm-hmm. I totally agree about what you said about the African countries trying to sell in Europe. The agriculture policy was really, really unfair. But I'm more worried about the financial sector, because if you look at the numbers, globalization has really, really expanded the financial sectors, while the real sector, let's say, it grows quite well, but not as impressive as the financial sector. So can you make some constraints about the financial sector?
I think that's the point about the need for regulation. I think the mistake many people would say that occurred in the financial sector was not the financial sector itself, is that it became a sector instead of a tool to deliver economic growth. Now, we again, in this room, we all know what the issues were around the creation of derivatives, the repackaging of instruments. But I think on this point, we don't want to throw away everything. We want to be a bit more careful about creating a regulatory environment that can make things work. One of the things that in my second book, I was trying to highlight is that a lot of the reasons we're in the situation we are in today around the world are from very deliberate policies. It's not an accident that we've ended up here. This is from policy making over the past 50 to 60 years that, by the way, looked like a good idea, but unfortunately, it actually had bad outcomes. And there are many examples. I don't want to spend too much time, but just to give you a bit of flavor, let's start with from my first book, aid. Sounds like a good idea. We should help countries that are poorer than us. But we know that the consequences have been very damaging. We've had corruption, inflation, debt burden, and so on. Let's look at the West. The United States has a policy, housing for all policy, for the past 50 years. It sounds like a good idea. Everybody should have a house. But what are the consequences of trying to deliver that program? we've ended up with a subprime crisis. People who should not own houses have been given access to credit to own houses. That's what the subprime crisis is. But again, it was a good intention with a bad outcome. Entitlement programs, the idea that we should all have a pension when we retire, sounds like a good idea. Why shouldn't we all have pensions? But can we afford it? We're now realizing actually we cannot afford it. Again, a good idea which has come up with a bad outcome. So I think it's really important and essential when we're talking about policy making and where the world is going right now, is that we need to be careful about these things that in the short term look very attractive, but in the long term can have very bad consequences.
Yeah. Those times we're talking about the financial regulation. In Europe, and particularly in Spain, there is a big issue about Iceland, because, you know, last week there is the sentence that they say, okay, it's fine, you don't have to give the money back to the English people and Danish people. What do you think about it?
Well, I think that the problem with those types of things, and I've heard this story in many different sort of incarnations. Again, let's look at Africa, where I come from. People say, oh no, Africa was given aid under different pretexts. Government stole the money, so we should not make them pay back. Let's cancel the debt. To me, there is an argument that can be quite compelling for doing those types of things, but let's understand what the consequences might be. It can create a moral hazard because people next time when Spain needs to borrow money, what are the Danish and the English going to say? They'll say, no, last time we lent you money, you didn't actually return it. And so you don't want to create those types of environments, which is why we're coming back to what I started off with, which is why Mario Draghi's comments have been so important for the survival of the Eurozone. And this is why Spain is seen itself in a much better place regarding its ability to fund in the markets, because people understand that there has to be a balance. You can't just cancel the debt and pretend it didn't happen. There have to be costs. There are costs associated with making decisions, and particularly bad ones. So do I think that there needs to be financial regulation? Absolutely. Do I think that there also needs to be some flexibility around some of the mistakes that have been made in the past? Yes, I do, which is why I was saying I think interest rates, again, in the Eurozone, there's room for them to be cut lower. But I think this is the challenge of policymaking. It's very easy to say, oh, no, we should cancel all the debt, but there are costs to that decision, and we need to think about what the longer-term costs are and not just be attracted or seduced by the short-term appeal of some of these statements.
I see, but in the case of Ireland, it was really shocking because, as you pointed out, the financial sector was 12 times the GDP. So it's impossible that these 300,000 people can give the money back to all these creditors.
But even in the case of Iceland, they're trying to restructure it in a way that it can work efficiently. So they didn't just say, well, too bad, we're not going to pay you. I mean, they did initially, but on a practical basis, they've realized that if you want to live in a capitalist, credit channel-based economy, you need to have creditors. You need to have somebody to lend to you. You cannot just default on them. There are some consequences to that.
Yeah, of course, people have to suffer the consequences for their actions. But I just remember Argentina. Argentina made a default, a big default with Kirchner, and then the money flowed back. I don't know, this is one of the cases that I don't know how moral hazard apply when a whole country just make a default, and 3 years later, the market just gives more money.
Well, in that case, and in the Mexican case in 1982, we've seen it in Russia, what ends up happening is you don't get zero. You get some money back. So the Brady bonds, for example, there is a form of restructuring that occurs. I think the other thing that's really important, and again, I can speak from my own experience growing up in Africa, and this is where I think policymakers have done a very bad job in Europe and the US, is that they need to tell people, the citizens of these countries, about what the real situation is. I remember when I was in the UK, about 6 months after the crisis hit, in 2009, coming into 2010, I walked into one of the a post office in London, and they were already, this post office, which is owned by the government, were already, well, it's not kind of privatized, but they were already starting to give us credit card application forms. So would you like to apply for a credit card? And I said, haven't we learned anything from what has happened? When I was growing up in Africa in the 1980s, one of the big themes from the Washington Consensus was structural adjustment. And I have to say, the African policymakers did a very good job. They told us the hard truth. They said, listen, we've made mistakes in the past. Now there's going to be very tough consequences. The civil service is going to get cut. People are going to be out of work. We're going to privatize these economies, and by the way, we're not doing this for you, we're doing this for your children. So in the future, we have to make difficult choices today to make sure that in the long term, we'll get to a better place. And they encouraged us as citizens to help other citizens who were going to be out of work, who were going to find difficulties. And I have to say, I have not heard a single European or American policymaker articulate exactly what has happened. There's been so much blame. Oh, it's the bank's fault. It's so-and-so's fault. It's the Democrats, the Republicans. It's the past leadership. But actually, all of us are to blame. You know, we enjoyed going on holidays on credit. Nobody asked where the money was coming from. We enjoyed building big houses. If you travel in the United States, people have big mansions. They don't have an income. So we have to accept that those are the consequences of excess that has occurred over the past 10 to 15, 20 years. And I'm not here to be a matron and scold people, but I think that if policymakers are honest enough to say this is the problem, I think people would be much more open instead of the draconian austerity measures that they're just throwing out at people. I think there's room for much more discussion here and much more improvement in what's happening around the world.
Yeah, because as you point out, the picture is really different in the different countries. For example, in Spain, the politicians told us that it's our fault, that we spend too much, and we live beyond our means. But actually, if you look at the data, this is not really true. I mean, the whole country, it's true. It lives beyond their means, but most part of the population just save money. And other part, of course, some promoters and builders, of course, they made a lot of credit, and then this is a big bubble, as you know. But now, this is this kind of externality problem that everybody is paying just for this issue. So I agree with you on some points, but at this point, I have some doubts that everybody has to pay for the blame of just one particular company.
Yes, I mean, I agree. And I think something a policymaker told me in China I thought was very interesting. They said the consequences of living in a democratic society are that you will continue to see productivity decline because policymakers are going to constantly try to win favors, win votes by giving favors. So to me, the ultimate culprit, the ones ultimately responsible for the financial crisis and the way the world is today, I would say were the policymakers. And I've explained already why. I think they had very good intentions to help the population. They wanted to win votes. If we give them pensions and health care and houses, they'll vote for us. So I can understand. It's very simplistic, but in a way, I understand that was the motivation. But unfortunately, the manner in which it was done, creating a credit market that was unsustainable, has left us with consequences that we all have to bear.
I will talk to you hours and hours, but I think the time is gone. So, any questions, suggestions, short speeches?
Aviam, el que farem avui serà vosaltres pregunteu, vostès pregunten, i el que farem serà que el senyor Sayer es tradueix, el que també vulgui explicar la senyora Dambisa. Qualsevol pregunta, ja sabeu, heu d'aixecar les mans, una mà només, ens indiqueu que voleu fer una pregunta i qualsevol pregunta és ben rebuda. Ja podeu preguntar qualsevol cosa d'àmbit internacional, economia més nacional. El senyor Carles Buesa, aquí a la taula presidencial, si us plau.
You could do it in English, then you save me to translate.
Un micròfon? Sí?
So, thank you very much. It has been very enlightening. Yeah, I have plenty of questions, but I would like just to raise two of them. Well, you were saying first that the policymakers have to address the reality of the situation and speak openly to the citizens. Well, the question we have here is if we have trust on our policymakers, which is also a side effect, no? Because I think that people are really able to do sacrifices when they do believe that there is a real roadmap, and that makes sense, no? The second point is we have in Europe a problem with the fiscal policies, and we see that the different measures to consolidate the balance sheets have been emphasizing the austerity on one hand, and on the other hand the raising taxes in some places. We see signs of exhaustion, I mean, in the middle classes in Europe. And this is raising a point if our welfare states will be sustainable in the long term. Tobin tax has been an example of a long path of creating a political transnational consensus, and we will see if it becomes effective or not. There are other, what's your opinion about the space that the Tobin tax is going to create for the countries applying it? And second, do you think that similar consensus could be created in several countries to change the tax structure, I mean, to somehow come back to the ages in where industries they were paying taxes are the places that they were doing their economic activity. Do you think that there is room for that?
So thank you very much. I guess to your first comment about what the role of policymakers are, I do agree. I think that the policymakers, I really believe that people want people to tell the truth. And this is the big missing piece. And I understand why. People believe that if they tell a story that people want to hear, a nice story, they'll get reelected. And in fact, going to the question about the UK referendum, I think that that's a classic example of pandering to the votes and not really to what the real situation is. And I think if the policymakers invested the time saying UK risks being nowhere, and we have a real opportunity to really bed down, let's really try and work together in the Eurozone, I think it would be a very different situation. So I do think that's a problem. To the point about Tobin taxes and taxes in general, there's clearly a level of taxation that works. And again, here, it's probably going to be a lot of obvious things. There's clearly a level of taxation that is important to fund public goods, education, healthcare, national security, and so on. And there's clearly a level of taxation that becomes onerous, one in which is basically unsustainable. And I think that we have basically lived in the last, shall we say, 50 years, oscillating between these two regimes. And to me, the best way, the shortest way to answer your question in the interest of time is to say the countries that have done an amazing job in balancing the role of the state with the private sector and balancing the tax rate are actually a lot of the Scandinavian countries, Scandinavia, so Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. And they're doing, it's amazing what they've done. They're actually cutting back. I mean, this is a model I spend a lot of time studying, so I think it's very interesting. They're cutting back on the size of the state, which is surprising because, as you know, they've had very high tax rates in those countries, particularly since they had a financial crisis. Sweden had a financial crisis in the 1990s. but they're cutting back on the role of the state to the extent that some of the public goods, like schools, private and education, are now being provided by the private sector, even prisons, private sector. And this, to me, is very innovative, but I think at the same time, it's going to the right balance of state versus private sector and getting the right level of balance on where the taxation should be. In a world that we live in today, where there's high unemployment, particularly high youth unemployment, slow to negative economic growth, there's always a temptation to go and hit the very sectors and industries that are creating jobs and are creating revenues. Around the emerging world, in particular right now, resource sectors, where commodity prices are relatively high, are particularly vulnerable for tax hikes. But you've touched on the Tobin tax, which is a big deal. We started in France. They really like the Tobin tax idea to obviously gain momentum. And to me, I think it's very dangerous to get to the point where on a Laffer curve, you get to a point where the tax becomes so onerous that you actually start to eat into businesses. What is that number? I can't say. To me, 75% taxation in France is too much. You could argue that some of the tax rates in other countries is actually too low as well. But I think we need to figure out what the balance is that makes it constructive for the long term. Yes, we need to raise revenues in the short term, but again, the temptation to raise taxes to these very high levels, particularly in key sectors that are very important, that are going to drive job creation, I think is very dangerous in the long term.
Molt bé, doncs la segona pregunta i la darrera, també a la taula presidencial.
Sí, first of all, congratulations for your exposition. That's been very, very interesting in the sense of global business and global activities about our environment. I represent small and medium-sized companies in Catalonia, maybe all small and medium companies. Our problem at the moment is to present to our government some points in order to make something for the medium, small and medium-sized companies. We are preparing a document to present to our central government in Spain, and I am very grateful if you can suggest some things to introduce in our document that we are preparing for the next month to give to our government, because it could be very interesting for our economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think the only thing I would say is I do strongly believe that the future of not just Spain or Europe, but of the world economy is the small and medium enterprises. And the biggest hurdle from my research and understanding of these markets of small and medium companies is credit. Their ability to actually grow their businesses and to run their businesses. And so to me, that would be the most important thing I would put into that document.
Thank you very much, Dambisa. Moltes gràcies també, senyor Salleras, per la seva col·laboració. Ja saben que fins aquí és aquest primer cara a cara d'aquesta quarta edició del Cornellà Creació Fòrum. La propera vegada serà una conferència dinar, en aquest cas al Museu Bar, amb la presidenta de Siemens Espanya, Rosa García. Abans, però, també els recordo que, com sempre, des de fa un temps tenim totes aquestes notícies, l'actualitat d'aquesta primera cara a cara, d'aquest primer debat, d'aquest primer face-to-face a les xarxes socials, on també poden connectar-se i també confirmar l'assistència del proper dia. Gràcies també pel seu suport, especialment a les empreses que un any més ens han fet costat, i esperem tornar a veure-us a la propera conferència. Fins aleshores, siguin feliços i bon dia.